we had a priest in our community for about a year and a half who was a techie. He had gotten a degree from Binghamton, New York, in technology, and he'd always say, "Now I can make that go faster." I said, "Will you please leave the thing alone?" The year and a half that he was with us, we had more problems with everybody's computer. And then when he left, we sang a Te Deum for a number of reasons, but that was one of them. So because I know nothing, I have this very, very healthy reverence for these things, and so leave it alone. So we want to talk about various programs of government aid, and the first point, as I alluded to the other night, we never want any government aid programs going directly to the school or the church. They are for parents, and that emphasizes, first of all, the philosophical principle that parents are the primary educators of their children, and it's they who have the right and the obligation to choose the most appropriate educational environment for their children. I mentioned this the other day. My doctoral dissertation at Fordham, as the bishop said, quote, in the Jesuit tradition as opposed to the Catholic tradition, we had absolutely nothing to do with Catholic education, but my thesis was on the Supreme Court in Catholic schools. And so it was, first of all, an analysis of the constitutional law and all of the Supreme Court decisions that affected Catholic schools or religious faith-based schools. This is not just about us, it's a bigger picture, that from the Supreme Court, starting, the first case was 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education. Just coincidentally, that case arose from the city of Trenton, New Jersey. The township, just outside Hamilton Township, just outside of Trenton, had embarked on a program of busing Catholic school kids. And no one thought anything of it, and then some atheists decided to oppose it, and it worked its way all the way up to and including the Supreme Court of the United States. Interestingly, the court came to the right decision, but using the wrong logic, and the wrong logic caused us problems for another 30, 40 years. So they said that it was possible to do this, but because it was the so-called child benefit theory. And so if you, for example, if your Catholic school went on fire, the fire department could go there and put out the fire, right? And in this instance, this was presented as a safety issue, so that in theory, kids wouldn't be walking from St. Gregory the Great in Hamilton Square to Notre Dame High School in Lawrenceville, all right? But all of the constitutional background that they used was this nonsense about separation of church and state. So the first thing you have, and I'm telling you all of this, and we're going to give you a link to the mini version of my dissertation. I'm telling you with this background because in your various states where these programs are going to arise little by little, if they haven't already, the first thing the opposition is going to say is, this is a violation of the First Amendment, separation of church and state. Well, the First Amendment, first of all, says nothing whatsoever about separation of church and state. The expression comes from a letter written by President Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association, who wanted him to declare a national day of prayer and fasting. Now, he probably was opposed to both prayer and fasting, but he says, I can't do this because there is a wall of separation between church and state. That's in a private letter. Well, it's a letter he writes as president, but his private interpretation of the First Amendment, which has nothing to do with constitutional law. And so there's a hiatus between that 47 decision of the court, and the next time we hear anything about this is 1971, the Lemon case. And at that point, we find various legislatures trying to work their way around the so-called wall of separation of church and state. And so using the child benefit theory, or if it's something that's being used for everybody and it can't be diverted to religious purpose. So the stupidity, for example, in the Lemon case was that yes, a state could give textbooks to a denominational school. By the way, also be careful of the language that's used. Anytime someone refers to one of our schools as sectarian, it is automatically negative. It's a pejorative term. It's suggesting separatism, all right? If they say faith-based, religious, that's all appropriate language. So you need to correct that right out of the paddock. So the question was, they can give a textbook. They can't give a map, a wall map, because, for example, a Catholic school teacher might say, there's Rome, and that's where the Pope is. So it would be diverting a neutral into a tool of proselytism. So Senator Daniel Pat Moynihan, who was kind of a weird kind of Catholic, he was pro-Catholic school aid but pro-abortion, he said, well, what about an atlas? It's a book of maps. So they said you couldn't give a map that's on the wall, but you could fund a textbook, all right? So all of these inconsistencies appeared. Several cases, and most of the time, these cases were decided in a very, very hostile manner. I give copious quotations from Supreme Court decisions which say clearly you can't trust a Catholic school teacher. Now, we also can't get ourselves into this problem. Some dioceses were saying, oh, well, don't worry, the history teacher is never going to mention religion in the class, all right? And that was some of the responses to the interventions in the various levels of courts that heard these cases. But going back to the foundations of the constitutional material, the First Amendment has two clauses, the free exercise and the no establishment, all right? So Congress shall make no law. First of all, who's to make no law? It's Congress. And at the time that the First Amendment was ratified, every state, every of the 13, all had established churches, all right? So, the Congregationalists in Massachusetts, the Anglicans in Virginia, and so forth. So there can't be a federal religion, but according to the First Amendment, there could be a state. Now, subsequently, the courts decided that the 14th Amendment incorporates all of that from the federal down to the state level, so you couldn't have a state church now. But the principle, nonetheless, is this. The free exercise of religion is the controlling element, and it is the first right? Freedom of religion. And it's not freedom from religion, it's freedom for religion. So any kind of legislation that we're involved with ought to be for the flourishing of religion, not for its inhibition. And but all of the cases against any kind of parochial school aid, and some of these guys like Ed Dorr from these hostile organizations would always refer to it as parochial aid, to make it sound like Medicaid and a government program and nasty suggestions all along with it. But at a certain point, and I worked for the Catholic League from 1980 to 85, we worked on a number of government aid programs. And of course, it was the Reagan years. And in 1983, we had the 10th anniversary of the Catholic League, and I had arranged for a variety of celebrations in New York and Washington and Rome. And we actually got an audience with King Ronald the Good, and a wonderful picture in the Oval Office with him. And Father Virgil Bloom, the founder of the Catholic League, he was born in Defiance, Iowa, and very appropriate. He was always on the push, and so Reagan is being very gracious to us, and Father Bloom says, Now, Mr. President, we got to get the voucher program through. We got to get the tuition tax credit thing through. And Reagan took him by both hands. He said, Reverend Father, I'm on your side. He said, go to Massachusetts Avenue to your bishops. They're the ones stopping the program from coming through. Because there was a horrible guy in the bishops' conference for decades, and who about only 3 or 4 years ago resigned and went to Georgetown, Carr, who was of the opinion that we could never have a bill passed benefiting Catholic schools if it came from a Republican administration. And so it was complete blockage, which occurred not in Congress and not in the White House, but in the bishops' conference itself, right? And so we find all these various legal theories surfacing. And when the first aid programs were being discussed in the 60s even, one of the problems was not only did we have the lion's share of non-government schools, but we were almost the only players. You had, some yeshivas, for example, in Brooklyn and I think LA had a few. The Lutherans, perhaps in the Midwest, had some schools, but these programs were really being opposed because of anti-Catholicism. Now that it's interesting too, the Southern Baptist Convention consistently wrote amicus briefs to the Supreme Court opposing government aid programs for, quote, sectarian schools. Now that they're in the school business, they've had a revelation, there's a new book of their Bible that says it's really not unconstitutional, right? Because they're in the school business now, all right? Chief Justice Warren was consistently opposed to any of these aid programs, and then all of a sudden, he starts writing opinions in favor of them. So I did a little research, and I found out that his son had married a Catholic, and their kids were in Catholic school, and so he had another revelation once his grandchildren were in Catholic school that they really weren't too bad, and so judgments started to move in the direction of 5-4 in our favor. So at the moment, it's a very healthy environment because we have an ecumenical interfaith base to promote these programs, and we've learned what kinds of programs work and don't work. And so Tom has been extremely active in this in New York State for years, and he, I think, will be able to give some practical indications about the kinds of programs, again, that have worked and haven't worked. So, Tom?
Thank you, Father Peter. He's right that the constitutional landscape has changed dramatically. One of the recent decisions last year was the Espinoza decision that took away the anti-Catholic Blane Amendments that had been kind of a scourge from the late 1800s. And then we've had with this court, certainly the court that we have right now, I can't imagine a single religious liberty case that we would lose. So they just upheld a foster care case. Our Lady of Guadalupe, obviously, that decision protected our right to hire whoever we wanted, and that could not be reviewed by labor departments and the NLRB and everybody else, or different human rights commissions within states and so forth. So we've been kind of, in particular, if you want to learn a lot of cases quickly, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty has been involved in almost every single win, and they've had like 6 wins in a row, including they defended the Little Sisters of the Poor in the contraceptive cases. So from a Supreme Court perspective, that's largely been cleaned up. And so the problem that we're left with is largely a question of form and a question of politics. So the question of form, and I have a preference for these 3 options. So it started out the kind of the school choice reform movement, largely in Milwaukee and Cleveland, which was a voucher program. And that was, as Father Peter pointed out, the key insight to kind of navigate all the court cases was if the aid was handed out to the parents as opposed to a government check to a school that was a Catholic school or Jewish school or whatever, that it was considered permissible, that the fact that the money in most cases, like in the Cleveland court decision and the Zellman decision, upwards of like 98% of the money ended up in the hands of religious institutions. And their view was that was incidental and that the money went to the parents. The parents were not required to redeem it at a religious school. They could have chosen a secular private school. And that was basically nobody's business other than the parents. So that's why all the programs that people are talking about are through the lens of aid to parents. And I also think from just a marketing perspective, asking people to bail out the Catholic Church is a less compelling case than helping parents make sure that their kids get the education that they personally believe is best for their children. So I think what started as a constitutional issue has actually generated a winning political strategy. It's one of the very few issues, and I worked on it for 8 years, in which, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of geography, regardless of race, everything else, these incredible coalitions have been built, regardless of faith. I mean, the number of organizations that are working together. So the three ways to do is vouchers, number one. I'm not a big fan of that for a variety of reasons, because it is a government funding program. And when you have a government funding program, what's happened is there's been this creep year after year in which more and more restrictions are placed on how the money is spent. And so that's just the limitation. The other thing, most of the voucher programs have been geographically limited. So like it started out in Wisconsin, just in Milwaukee, started out just in Cleveland. They've been able to add other cities, but despite an incredible amount of political money, they have, and very favorable governors, they have not been able to get to a statewide perspective in any of the voucher states. So the next idea, which a lot of people talk about, is education savings accounts. And you could go to edchoice.org, which is an offshoot of what used to be called the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation. But they do continuously update all the different kinds of school choice programs all across the countries. That has taken off in some states. Some states just create a tax-free way for people to save. Just like on the college level, there's what's called 529 accounts for people to save tax-free for college. They allow people to do that for K-12. Some states actually make initial deposits into those accounts. So it's not exactly a matching program, but basically the same idea as like a corporate matching program would be in a retirement context, is to make the money build up quicker and quicker and quicker. The third idea, which I like the best, is a tax credit scholarship program. Florida, where we are now, Jeb Bush, it actually was a businessman from Tampa who got the ball rolling, but Jeb Bush, in his first year as governor, signed it into law. And that was to create a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. So right now, there is a tax deduction for donations to Catholic schools or any religious school or any nonprofit. And so what it does is it takes that deduction, and instead of it being worth like 35 cents of a dollar or 38 cents of a dollar, it moves it up to 100 cents in a dollar. So I joked if we got this in New York, I was going to quit my job and become a fundraiser and work for a percentage. And just walking up and down Park Avenue, I could raise all the money. Because the sales pitch to the donor is, you could send the money to the government, who knows what they're going to spend the money on and whether you'd agree with it or not. Or you could take that same dollar and help a bunch of kids get an education that their parents want them to get. And so in Florida, it's because it's essentially a cost-free donation at that point. In Florida, they started out at $50 million. And a couple of years ago, last time I checked, they were over $1 billion in donations that were being, and at the time of the last gubernatorial election, more than 100,000 kids were receiving these tax credit scholarships. It's the largest school choice program in the entire country. So based on the success in Florida, and I'm friends with the person who pushed it through in Florida, a guy named John Kirtley, an organization called Step Up for Students. You can go on their website to learn more about that. There are now about 20 states that have scholarship tax credits. I spent 5 years in New York trying to get it done, and got all the way to the point where I had 75% of the Democratic legislators, over the wicked opposition of the teachers union, not only were in favor, but actually put their name on the bill. So it just, because when you frame it as a tax credit or as an incentive, as opposed to, the unions kept saying, like, you're taking money out of the budget. And they were never able to get traction on that argument. So everybody's in favor of tax breaks. So it just made it a lot easier. We got 90% of all the Black and Hispanic legislators. I was told if we did this, like this is a tax break, we would never get any support from them at all. And then we went to them one by one and just had 90% of them, 75% of the Assembly Democrats, much higher, and the Senate at that time was controlled by Republicans. So we kind of had that. And then early on, I told people that were putting up the money for this that I would get Andrew Cuomo to, of all people, the guy whose father did the Notre Dame speech on abortion, to actually come out in front of it and be in favor of it and be the cheerleader for it. And it's like, it will never happen, never happen. He told me it's unconstitutional, and that's why he's not doing it. He says Andrew Cuomo never met a law that he wanted to have that he didn't do because he thought it was unconstitutional. Like, that's not in his personality, right? So what he's really saying is, I think you're a bunch of ragtag, small number of people, and I'm not. There's the teachers union, and then there's you. And so that gets to essentially the political problem. So we spent 5 years building up a coalition of 300 organizations. And the key insight, which was a ethnic and religious insight, was a lot of the labor unions, at least in New York, but it's true in a lot of cities. Chicago, for example, took the strategy we had in New York and got it through with the help of Cardinal, got it through in Illinois. So they have a very successful scholarship tax credit program there. And they did the same thing, which is building up the coalition. But anyway, I got all kinds of community groups, business groups, ethnic groups. But the key thing that changed everything is I lined up I got 40 labor unions to be in favor of it. And I got labor unions that collectively represented more people than the teachers unions did. So the question is, how was I able to do that on this issue? Is I went to Cardinal Dolan, who's got a big personality. He previously was the bishop of Milwaukee, so he knew, school. He was definitely schooled on school choice by the time he showed up in New York. And I said, most of the unions, a lot of the unions in New York are Catholic unions. It's still the case, like all the law enforcement, the firefighters, the people who collect bags at JFK and LaGuardia airports, they're all run by either Irish or Italian people who are Catholic. And so we started out with the New York City firefighters, an hour-long presentation prepared. And the guy said, you don't have to tell me all of that. So I was like he's not going to do it. And he said, everybody on the board is Irish. We all went to Catholic schools, Catholic colleges, and our kids are all in Catholic schools. Whatever the Cardinal wants is fine with us. And then once I had the firefighters, I got the state police on. Once I had the state police, I got the New York City PBA, which is the largest police union in the country. I got them because the Cardinal did a private mass for labor union leaders, and then after took them through the back of St. Patrick's to his residence, which is quite posh, by the way. And he has breakfast, and we set up 3 tables with an empty chair at each table. So he kind of progressively went from table to table.
3 breakfasts.
Right, well, he likes eating. But it was a little early to be drinking whiskey, but anyway, he went from table to table. And so what that meant is on either side of him, we put the most influential labor union leaders. And so 6 of them got to tell their friends that they were had breakfast sitting next to the Cardinal. And then he took pictures with all of them. And I knew we were getting the PBA when he took a picture with the head of the PBA and his wife. And then after that picture was taken, the wife pushed the head of the PBA out of the picture. I don't know if she was planning on divorcing or something, didn't want the picture ruined. And then she wanted a picture with the Cardinal. And then I said, I bet you when they drive back to Long Island, because almost every cop lives on Long Island, not in New York City, if they're from New York City, that she was telling them, give him whatever he wants. I want to get invited back. I want a front row seat to the Easter Mass or whatever she was. So sure enough, a day later, he went on. And then we cut some deals on different issues, like one of the 3 most influential Democratic unions was the people who represent the doormen for apartment buildings in New York City, sell hot dogs at Yankee Stadium, and the baggage handlers at JFK and LaGuardia. One union. Hispanic-dominated union. They had a labor dispute. The trade was the Cardinal would agree and it would allow a picture to be taken of him listening to their complaints. He wouldn't take a position on it because it wasn't his job to negotiate their labor dispute. And they said if he did that, because they obviously were going to use the picture to get kind of the moral high ground, that they would sign on to it. So he did it in the morning, the afternoon, they put out a statement. And that's when we got Andrew Cuomo. Because that was one of the 4 or 5 unions that were most important to him politically. And he couldn't believe we got all of these labor unions. And then he couldn't believe that we had already lined up the votes in the legislature. It was a perfect plan, except, well, I actually had in my 5-year plan that one of the risks was, this is true in New Jersey too, corruption investigations. So we had it all lined up. We had the governor doing commercials in favor of it, which people were stunned by. And then the Senate Majority Leader, who was with us, and the Assembly Speaker, who was with us, got arrested by the FBI. And then it was like we couldn't get, once that happened with the change in leadership, we couldn't get it to happen. But the point to that is there is a way to create, absent the corruption part of the story. It had tremendous, that we could get 75% of the Democrats, despite labor union opposition, to be in favor, means they knew that we were on the winning side of the issue. And we never said to, we were very careful, we're not telling you don't give money to the teachers' unions. Give as much money as you want. It's none of our business. But we also want this at the same time. And if you're a politician, what they all know is basic math, which is their job is to have more friends, not less friends. So you have a chance to expand your constituent base. And so basically all of them bought into that argument. There's other things we did person by person to get particular individuals on, but that was the basic idea. So that's my big idea on that one. I would say there are a couple things that are, why this really matters, other than obviously schools are closing all over the place. The trajectory, I just checked yesterday, we're now down to, in the mid-60s, we had 5 million Catholic school students. We're now down to 1.6 million. So the last year with the pandemic has actually surprisingly been really good for Catholic education because we were open and the other team was closed. So most dioceses, despite kind of taking a hit at the front end of the pandemic, when they rolled into the next September, ended up having a pretty good year. But it's important that, one, the parents need the help. Two, that we need in terms of kind of the right to hire whoever we want to hire, right? The court case helped with that, but people politically trying to do it. So there needs to be, if we're going to really be an alternative system, we have to be an alternative system. And that means, one, hiring, and two, belief. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in, is protecting our right to hire who we want. And with all the kind of great urgency around the issue of transgender, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, and all this kind of stuff, if we really want to have a pluralistic education system in this country, there are lots of parents who are not buying into it. And I'm not getting into whether those things are good or bad, but there's a huge swath of parents in every single state in the country that are not comfortable with all of these developments. And so for that reason, faith reasons, and 1,000 other reasons, we have to protect our right very vigorously to design our schools in accord with our beliefs and accord with what our parents are looking for. And we can't allow government to interfere with that. So I think school choice is the way to do it. In Florida, because you have over 100,000 people, the last governor and this governor, Rick Scott, who's now a U.S. Senator, and Ron DeSantis both think they got elected by the margin of school choice moms. So they are completely on fire on the issue, and that's affected kind of all across the country how people are looking at the issue. And they're looking at the kind of the mixed demographics of who's, I kept arguing to people in New York, most of the parents we're talking about are Democrats. Most of the parents in our schools in Boston are obviously Democrats. Most of them would probably call themselves progressive. So like, these are your people. Like, you're not, that we're asking you to help out. So when we were doing the COVID relief money, we even had Elizabeth Warren helping us. Just because the number of kids that we have in our Catholic schools. We didn't ask her to do it publicly, but. So there are politicians understand kind of the math of this. We don't have 5 million people, but we still have a lot of people. And we have more people than anybody else in private education. And so that's a big deal. So with that, let me wrap up. Sit back to Peter.
Just a couple of points. Tom talked about the Blane Amendment. Do you all know what this Blane Amendment is? It started in the Empire State, and it comes from the time of the Know-Nothings and the nativists. And Blane wanted to be sure that no Catholic school got any kind of government money. And so an amendment to the New York State Constitution, under his name, made it clear that no money could go to any sectarian school. And that spread like wildfire throughout the country through the KKK and all the rest of them. And so what was about 39 states, I think, at one point had Blane amendments. So legislators actually were getting off the hook locally because people would say, well, let's do a tax credit thing. Let's do a voucher thing. Oh, I'm all in favor of it, but we have a Blane amendment, so it's unconstitutional anyway, all right? And these latest Supreme Court decisions, interestingly enough, 6 of the 9 on the Supreme Court went to Catholic schools. And the one that irks me the most is, what's her name? Sotomayor, right? She has publicly admitted that she'd be nothing without her 12 years of Catholic school, but when Mother Cabrini's high school was going down the bowl, she didn't give $1 to the campaign to save the school, right? So, at any rate, but we have the court now that's very, very favorable, and it's clear that, although they didn't say this explicitly in the last court decision, that the Blane amendments are gone constitutionally. So that issue can't be used by a legislator. The pandemic provided us with the best PR for our schools. It showed the government school system being completely bankrupt, and the ones who came out were really bad were the teacher unions, and still, even last week, still more of a drumbeat from them. So I think their credibility is pretty low. And as Tom made eminently clear, the importance of forming coalitions. I always say conservatives are so bad at networking. The left know how to do it perfectly, all right? There's one anti-abortion organization in the country, all right? There are 55 pro-life organizations. And you say, well, why don't you work with that group? Oh, no, that's a very different approach, right? And so we all go down together. So the importance of coalitions. With Cuomo, I always get a perverse chuckle out of it. He'll tell you that he's opposed to the death penalty because of Catholic teaching against the death penalty. He has no problem of imposing his personal view on the death penalty because of his Catholic beliefs. But although the Catholic Church teaches even more clearly about abortion, somehow or other, he can't impose that on the rest of society. He's just a phony, just like his old man. Anyway, questions, comments? Yeah.
2 quick things. One, I'm glad you brought up step up. Speaking of school down here, I think about 20 to 25% of my students were online. And the fact that they overcame opposition to get installed and then survived 2 suits from the Public Schools Union, it strengthened the argument of how popular and how effective it was. The second thing is working with the Beckett funds. One of their mantras is double down on mission. So in this era of lawsuits and everything else, one thing that we found to be very effective is you have to have clarity of mission for your onboarding processes for those folks, your stakeholders that are a part of your school system. So you have to have clarity of mission, but more importantly, that mission, even if that's clearly outlined in the job descriptions, the contracts, your teacher ministerial language, it has to be a part of the process through evaluation, through reflection, such that that language permeates the development or the oversight of those individuals. Because it's no good to bring somebody on and say, okay, I hear the church teachings do X, Y, and Z, and then it's never mentioned again by any of your school leaders, and then that person runs into trouble 2 years later doing something that's anti-Catholic, and then the judge, even though most likely the ruling will be held in your favor because of the for private schools being hired by who we need to, it's a lot easier when you can say, well, our entire evaluation process was one of formation for this person, such that they've heard this mission-centric language time and time again throughout their whole tenure here.
Well, and
can I add to that point?
Just Tom made the important point about having this oath of fidelity for faculty. And I would present it not as, we're putting you in a corner. We're giving you the opportunity to profess your faith in the church and in the church's educational process. We want to highlight your commitment in front of the students and the parents, all right? So, but if that's in the mix, that makes it even more difficult for someone to say that, well, it was just a phys ed teacher or whatever.
Yeah, so the way the court case reads is if a person is like a regular teacher, but the cases could come down that if you're a religion teacher, you're covered. That's kind of always been the case. But if your job does not include religion, like you're just the science teacher, right? And that the case could go the other way, or you're a secretary in the office or something. So if you want within schools that you're running to say, for example, like you're not going to hire somebody who's shacking with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and who is openly, blatantly on Facebook living in just outright contradiction of church teaching, then you have to make sure that every single person in the school is involved in the mission, which is actually a great thing. This is where the legal, to maximize your legal position is actually a good thing from a Catholic identity perspective. So you want, everybody involved. So the way we're setting up our school, like everybody from the accountant to the guy who picks up the garbage to whatever, are all being hired on the basis of being devoutly Catholic. But we're giving people every single person responsibility for the faith formation of the kids. So that literally, because I don't want to have anyone in this particular school who I could not remove if they were contradicting faith. Because a kid doesn't distinguish between a teacher and the woman at the front desk or whatever. It's like, oh, I don't believe that stuff. Nobody believes that. That has an incredibly devastating effect on a young child. So you have to put yourself in a position where you could remove anybody who contradicts church teaching. But you have to consult with your lawyers to figure out how to do that.
There was a case that you may have heard of about a year and a half ago in New Jersey, in the Archdiocese of Newark. At this particular school, for one reason or another, there were not enough girls in 7th grade to field a basketball team. And so, of course, little Susie says, well, that's not fair, so I want to play on the boys' team. And the sister principal, a Salesian sister, they're very good, she said, no, that's not possible. So, of course, they went to the pastor, and the pastor said, sister is right, it's not going to happen. So, of course, they go to court. And they get some judge to say, Susie's got a right to be on the boys' team. And so the season finished, and it's about time then for re-registration for the next school year. And so they go to re-register, and the sister principal says, you're not welcome in this school for next year. Your children are not coming back. There was another girl in the family. And they said, why not? And she said, well, first of all, you violated the contract that you signed. In the Archdiocese of Newark, parents sign a contract saying they will never sue the parish, the school, the principal, or anybody else, or the Archdiocese. You sued us. You violated your terms of the contract, number one. Number two, you've created chaos in the school and parish community because people were taking sides and all the rest of it. So, of course, they then went to court again. And it went through a whole series, and it didn't quite get to the state Supreme Court, but just below it. And they subpoenaed the Cardinal Archbishop. And everybody kind of held his breath, what is he going to say? And the first item on the news in New York and New Jersey that night was the testimony of Cardinal Tobin, who said, first of all, I am the oldest of 13 children. All of us went to Catholic school. I have the highest estimation for Catholic education. I believe every Catholic kid belongs in a Catholic school. That said, and we took a breath, he said, I don't see how these children could ever come back to our school. He said, it's not the children's fault. It's what the parents have done, and they've made this environment so toxic that it would be impossible to move forward. So my testimony is they cannot come back to our school. And the judge said, well, thank you, Your Eminence. He said, but I have a prior question. How the hell did this case ever get here to begin with? We have no authority over your school.
That's right.
Yeah, Carlos.
Well, I just want to comment a couple things on Tom's point. It's a level of granularity for the pastors in this room. So I'm from Florida. My younger brother the only reason that the Archdiocese and Archdiocese of Miami and Hialeah, ground zero for recent arrival, primarily 98% Hispanic. I say all that as quick context because about 2 months ago, Governor DeSantis, who seems to be on the national radar for different things, and some people love him, some people hate him, whatever one thinks, he's done a very good job, as Tom was pointing out here for education as his predecessors. He went down and signed the Step Up program legislation there, and it was pretty amazing. And to Father's point, which he's been very adept at doing, is building coalitions. So you had, picture this, a kind of old school, a little bit of rundown, typical Catholic school in the inner city, taking care of the folks that nobody else will take care of or not well. And then you've got this kind of perplexed Father Hector, Father Davis, you probably know Father Hector, kind of looking around because there's all these African Americans and all these politicians and all these African Americans, Protestant, hardcore, evangelicals, all sorts of congregations, Assemblies of God, sitting there all championing and rallying around, in a proper sense, ecumenical interests for the kids and giving parents the school choice. So that's kind of the coalition building part of it, and how, in fact, what Tom was sharing, what we have seen here in Ground Zero, where I'm pretty sure that a lot of congregations would never vote for anybody who's Republican or whatever, not to get political, but only because that's just not in their heritage. But yet, on this issue, they have rallied around very effectively. And by the way, DeSantis is running against Gillum, an African American, who is quite popular and completely in the pocket of the unions and anti-school choice. So again, by the way, that election was only decided by about 30 or 40,000 votes, just for context. To your point, two of the issues that I saw there, and I talked to my brother about it, was the importance of the parochial school model and the nexus between the parish and the school. Father Hector has to be very clear with the principal of who's on whose payroll. Sounds pretty easy, but then all of a sudden you start looking at divided duties or whatnot. Because can you imagine Archbishop Wency gets a call and says, "Why is this janitor being paid for, a parish janitor being paid for by the step up that's going to the school?" That is not a call that, His Excellency wants to get. So it just goes to the issue of one, and by the way, Father Hector is pretty good about keeping good relationships with his neighbors, with his Protestant and other neighbors, as well as just the community background. So one, the importance of the pastor to go out and do that coalition building at your local level, subsidiarity. And then secondly, the fact that when you get into, make sure that business manager, the accountant, or yourself, or the finance council, parochial council, is being very attentive to some of these nuts and bolts things, because the last thing you need is the Miami Herald reporting, look at the Catholic schools, where it's whatever that term was used, that was the
sectarian, yeah.
Sectarian or parochial aid or whatever.
Well, with another example of this, in the inner city, on the inner city front, when I was a seminarian, I was working in an inner city parish school for a pastor who had taught me in high school. I actually served as the vice principal. It was an inner city parish that was the flagship parish of the diocese at one point. Bishops and governors were the graduates of the school and the whole business. And by the time we got there in the 70s, 1/3 of the parish was still the old elite whites who had been there for 150 years. About another third were Hispanics, sort of nominally Catholic, and the other third Black Baptists. And the second year that I was there, the pastor said to the janitor, who was rather ineffectual, it was around the Feast of the Assumption, he said, have you checked, the furnace that's going to fire up after Labor Day? We start schools up north and after Labor Day. And so the poor guy comes back to the rectory and he says, Monsignor, it's not firing up. He said, well, why are you telling me? I don't have anything to do. Call the furnace company. So that guy comes and he says, Monsignor, that's the original furnace that came with the school, which was about 85 years ago. He said, can't even be on life support. You need a new furnace. And it was going to cost $78,000. And Monsignor Shenrock could get, water out of a rock. And so he just put the word out that the school was going to close, was not going to open in September. And the minister, the black minister for the Black Ministerial Association in Trenton, came to him and he said, Monsignor, Blessed Sacrament School can't close. The future of our community is in that school. And he said, well, I appreciate your vote of support, but for us Catholics, it doesn't run on indulgences, and for you, it doesn't run on Bible verses. It's money, and I don't have $78,000 for a new boiler. That weekend, in all the black parishes or congregations in West Trenton, a collection was taken up, and on Monday morning, they delivered $250,000 to the rectory. Right? But that shows when they realize what we have to offer. And that Black Baptist minister said, the future of our community is in your school. We sent 2 of our boys from those years to West Point. So I think that's an important thing. And at times, and some of us were saying this before, we're a little too humble about what we do well. And if you don't toot your own horn, no one's going to do it for you. Right? There are plenty that are going to be sniping at you. But